All right, hey everyone. Today I'm here with the mechanical engineer. How you doing?
Hello, I'm doing great. How about you?
Good. So last time we kind of did a brief review of all the stuff, mostly related to different data types, the basic data types in Python. We kind of went through and did some little challenge questions, right?
hmm
So, excuse me. So today I think what we're going to go over is functions. So do you know anything about functions from any other languages you may have used?
From my C++ days a few years ago, I do remember doing writing like main and then open parentheses, or maybe it was curly brackets, and then um, having the function, perform a few things, and then you have to call that function outside of those parentheses, and that's how we used functions at least.
Okay. Yeah, so functions are a way to avoid writing code over and over again.
hmm
It also helps to kind of modularize your code a little bit, so make it really easy to follow. Basically, functions can have a very specific purpose or function, I guess, for lack of a better term. And you can call those functions later with different parameters as you need them, right? So you mentioned
hmm
the main function, which technically something very similar to C++ exists in Python, but we won't get into that today. But basically, so to start off, why don't we just define our first function? So the syntax for that is def, as in like define,
hmm
and then the name of your functions, you can call it my function or something like that. And then it's an open parenthesis. And then inside of this, you can have any parameters that you will need. So let's just assume that this will take in a string, and we're going to call that string, param or something like that. Right. So, and then at the end of this line, you can just put a colon, and then that will put you within anything you write now within this level of indentation will be within this function. That make
hmm
sense?
Yeah.
All right, cool. So you did it just without me telling you, but I don't know if you remember in C, C++, you have to basically tell your compiler in this case, the interpreter, what the return type is of your function. And you'd also have to say the data type of each of your parameters. But in Python, all of that is assumed, and you don't have
Ah,
to tell it.
cool.
So param in this case technically could be anything, but we're going to assume that it's a string for our little function here.
Okay.
So all this function is going to do is let's just print, you know, hello. And then I don't know if you remember, we did that dot format. Do you remember that?
The dot format?
Yeah,
Uh, no.
that was a way. That's how we got our parameters to be printed to the screen, or our variables to be printed. So in this case, all you did was it's open, close curly braces, and then at the end of the string, you say dot format at
Right,
the outside
outside.
of the.
Okay.
Yep. This is we're calling this on our string.
Yeah.
And then inside the parentheses there, we put the variable, which is param in this case.
Okay.
All right, cool. So you basically just wrote your first function. So why don't you hit enter a few times to get below that? And then outside of your function, let's just call my function with any parameter you want. So to do that, you just type my underscore function, and then you can pass any string you want. Juice. Awesome. So why don't you run this and we'll see what happens. Oh,
Hmm.
looks like you're running the review code.
Yeah.
There you go.
Oop. Hello, juice.
There it is. So the only thing that ran, or I guess the first thing that ran was line 4, and then line 4 called your function at the top there and printed your, hello and then the variable name, right?
hmm
All right, cool. So now what we can do is, so again, functions are, you're going to use them every time you code, no matter what.
hmm
So why don't you call my function with a few more strings below that just to show you that call it one more time too.
Is that what we're looking for?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, cool. So now a cool thing about functions too is that they can call other functions. So why don't you write another function below your top one there?
Mhm.
You can call it what it may, func2 or something like that.
Do I want to define it? Am I defining a function here?
Yep.
Okay.
And then why don't you just take in some value? Just call it value. We're going to use numbers here. I'm going to show you something really important about functions. So in this, I want you to say x equals 10. And then below that, print the value inside function. So print like in function.
In function.
Like as a string, sorry. Like yeah, because we're basically just going to let the, print to the console that we're inside the function. And then you can just do a colon, space, and then hit right. You can go right one more, and then comma x. So this will print in function and then the value of x. All right.
Okay.
So now what I want you to do now though is assign x equals 50 right here outside. And then below that, call function 2. And you pass x. And then outside there now, I want you to print outside of function, comma x. So very similar to what we had on line 6.
Like the words outside function.
Yep. And then colon and then comma x like we did before.
Okay. Huh.
All right. So what do you think? Why don't you delete all the other prints here and the other calls? So now what do you think is going to happen for in function there? What do you think is going to happen? And then on line, so basically, what do you think on line 6 is going to be printed? And then what do you think on line 10 is going to be printed?
On line 6, we'll get 10, and then on line 10, we'll get 50 because, no, wait, sorry.
You know what we can do actually is in the definition of function 2 there, why don't you get rid of value and we'll just make it have no parameters. Right, and then the call, you got to get rid of the x on line 9.
Oh, okay.
Right. All right, cool. Now, what do you think will happen? What's going to print on line 6 and then what's going to print on line 10?
Well, line 6 in conjunction with this will print 10, and then this should print 50. So it should go 10 and then 50.
Okay.
Right?
Yep.
Cool.
Why do you think that happens? Because we're in the function there on line 5, we're assigning x equals 10, right?
Yeah.
Why is the value outside of the function not 10, even though technically line 5 executed after line 8 there?
Because first we define our functions, and that's fine. And then line 8 we define x, but then when we call this function, it defines x as 10, and then it prints 10, and then back in this world, in the non-function world, x is still 50. So that's why it prints 50.
Yes, that's actually, honestly didn't think you'd get that. So you said in this world. So what that's called, the scope. So in the scope of our function, any variables that we define inside of that function only live within that scope. So as soon as line 5 there, as soon as that exits that function, and we quit back out to the top level of indentation, then anything we previously defined inside of that function is dead. So at that top level scope, x is still alive as 50. So when we get out, it'll print 50. So that's a really important thing. It's called scope. Scope also exists. You can think of scope in Python as when you have to use that indentation level. So if you have an if statement or for loop or something like that, each of those have a corresponding scope associated with them. So a really common thing is if people are assigning variables within a conditional statement, like an if, right?
Yeah.
When it quits out of that scope, that variable will no longer exist to the value that you assigned it as. So it's something that you picked up really quickly, but for a lot of people, that's something that's really hard to understand. And you called it your own little word was in the world, which I like. So
world, yeah.
All right, cool. So now let's write one last function, and I'll show you this thing called default parameters. So you can call it many inputs or something like that, because we're gonna have a lot of arguments. And then why don't you have A, B, C, and D? And then inside of that, let's just print out A plus B plus C plus D.
Okay.
So now below that, what do we call it? And you can call it with any values you want. Sure. All right, cool. So now what I want you to do is inside of your function definition on line 12 there, next to D with no spaces, say D equals 1,000. And then next to C, make that C equals, I don't know, 100. Now, on line 15 there, copy that line.
Line 15.
Yep. And paste it below.
Here?
No, on line 17. And now what I want you to do is get rid of 3 and 100 in that call. So what do you think is going to happen here?
I think they'll actually be the same, because I think the function many inputs will it'll kind of ignore these because we already defined C and D here.
So you think on line 16 it'll print out what does that equal? 1,103 both times?
Yes.
All right. Why don't you try that? Right. So this is called a default parameter. So once you start building projects and you have a lot of these different libraries you're pulling from, these things called APIs, and you're basically calling functions that other people wrote and putting them into your program. And a lot of times these functions have these default parameters. And kind of the benefit of those is that, let's say for whatever reason, C and D are generally always going to be 100 and 1,000 unless you're kind of an expert and you're doing something very niche and very specific where you have to update those values. It would make sense that every time you don't, as you know, the person using this API, you don't have to always keep track of all these parameters. But if you are doing a very specific task, it might make sense where you have to update it. So on line 16 there, it's really important to note that when you call functions that they are positional, meaning, you know, A corresponds to the first, B second, C third, and D fourth, right? But if they have default arguments, like in that first one there with C and D, you don't have to say that C equals something or D equals something else.
Gotcha.
So basically it's a way to say, like, you know, for the most part, hey, this is probably always going to be these values here, so don't worry about it. But, you know, if you're getting weird behavior and you want to update them, they're here if you want.
Okay.
And generally, when you have these really long, a lot of parameters to these functions, sometimes when you use, like, if you're into data science or something like that, there might be, you know, 5 or 6 parameters. You'll do this next thing here. So why don't you just copy line 17 and put it on line 18? So now let's say we want C to be 100. We want it to take the default argument. Say we don't know what it is, but we know that we want the default. How do you think that if we want to pass D as 5, how do you think we do that? So we don't want to change C. We want to keep C as 100.
Or maybe just default.
Close. So what you actually are going to do is in line in the function there, you just say d equals 5.
Oh.
And then the kind of way to do it is no spaces. Yeah. There you go. And it kind of gave you that syntax highlight to say that like this is a parameter you're changing. So why don't you run that and we'll see if we get the right output. It should print what 100. There you go.
Sweet.
So it's important to know that these are positional. So for the most part, right, you have A and B. Those absolutely must fall first and second in your function call. And now anything after that can have default arguments. So you wouldn't be allowed to set A to a default value and B not. So all of your default values have to be at the end of your function definition. So that's just kind of, it's a quick little way to designate the exact parameter that you want to update. So
sweet. Awesome.
So yeah, I think that's going to close out our initial function lesson. Do you have any questions?
No, the functions seem pretty powerful.
Yeah, no, you'll definitely, 90% of what you're going to be writing is going to be functions, if not more than that. So, we keep writing everything on that sort of top level there on the left, because we're just writing like basic scripts. But, if you're actually writing code that's going to be used by other people, generally you're building out these APIs and you're writing code that can be used in a lot of different ways. So.
Gotcha. Awesome.
So yeah, good job. I think next time, with functions in mind, we're going to tackle this concept called recursion. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it basically means that functions can call themselves. So that's what we're going to do next time. But